ABSL Summit. Transform to thrive.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I work in Shell's scenario team, where we aim to try and help the company navigate the future. So I'm going to share a few thoughts on how we do that. I'm trying to make 3 points with you. The first is that scenarios are about conveying uncertainty, and they're not predictions or forecasts. I'm going to keep repeating that. The second is to build plausible scenarios. So it's something that actually happen. You need to undertake a systematic assessment of the business environment. In other words, what's going on in the world. And the third thing is, for a scenario to be compelling, it has to have both a narrative and quantification. The story on its own isn't strong enough. A quantification on its own doesn't have enough flow to it. So those are the components. So let's start by addressing prediction. As you all know, prediction is difficult, especially about the future, as physicist Niels Bohr was attributed to say. There are countless examples of leaders and experts and pundits making completely wrong predictions. The computer executive who thought the prospects for the PC was a sale of 1 unit. The politician who thought country A would never invade country B. The energy expert like me that thought that oil prices would never fall to a certain level, and then they do the week after you've told your bosses. The fact is, the world is extremely complex, and many, if not most, future events are highly unpredictable. So what can we do? Well, back in the 1960s, my predecessors faced a problem like this. At that time, oil companies were a bit like big tech companies today. They were riding high and very, very much felt sure of themselves. However, a few people in Shell's planning department, as we were called then, weren't so sure. They noted the formation of OPEC in 1960 in Baghdad and sensed a change in the balance of power between the resource-owning countries, particularly in the Middle East, and the companies like Shell that were producing their oil. This wasn't a message that could easily be conveyed as an assertion. You don't walk into the board of directors and say change is coming. They need to see more than that. Nor could it be calculated. So they decided to develop a couple of scenarios comprising of a narrative and a bit of quantification. These scenarios planted the idea of change in the minds of Shell's board of directors of the day. And it allowed them to quietly reposition Shell, which proved to be a wise move when the oil crisis of the 1970s came along. Now, the key thing here is I didn't say forecast or predict. Instead, my predecessors opened the directors' eyes to the range of possible futures. And that was enough to prepare them for what turned out to be a tumultuous decade. So, how should we think about the future? Well, as William Gibson, a futurist, put it, the future is here today, it's just unevenly distributed. So we need to undertake this systematic assessment of the business environment, what is going on in the world. And I'm going to propose to you a model based on a core organization with 2 layers wrapped around it. So within the organization, what is it you're trying to do? What do you see as the critical uncertainties in your business or activity area? And what is the relevant timeline? For some companies, 5 years is a long time. In an energy company, we tend to think out several decades because of the length of our asset life. Around that core, you have an inner layer, and that's the working environment. And this is who you interface with directly. It's your customers, your partners, communities where you have your assets, the regulator, competitors, etc. What are the dynamics between these players? Where do they think, where are their critical uncertainties there? Finally, the outer layer. This is the contextual environment. This is the wider world. It includes the social, technological, economic, environmental, and political trends. This might seem a long way from everyday business, but these trends will find their way into your business or organization eventually. So again, where are the critical uncertainties? Now let's use this framework to explore something hopefully some of you know a little bit about. That's the future of the car, or as my American friends call it, the automobile. My team in Shell are responsible for thinking about how quickly you all are going to go out and buy electric cars. Essentially, when is the world going to move from tanking their cars to charging their cars? Now, to explore this problem, it's often easier to go outside in. So we start by looking at the external environment. The first cars built in the late 1800s were actually electric. If you go to a car museum, you can see them there. But they quickly got overtaken by the internal combustion engine because of range. And once Henry Ford had worked out how to mass produce them, the configuration of 4 wheels with an engine at the front has been with us ever since. However, the electric car is now making a big comeback. There are around 50 million electric vehicles on the road out of a total fleet of 1.3 billion. So it's a lot, but not a lot yet, but it's growing. Now, for those who've driven an EV, I think you'll agree they're typically a good product, very responsive, albeit perhaps a little bit more expensive than their internal combustion engine competitors. Now, what happens when a better product comes along, particularly one that's based on fundamentally better technology? EVs are about 3 times more efficient than internal combustion engine vehicles. So, the new technology is going to win. It's as simple as that. Is that a prediction? I'd argue it's based on history, thermodynamics, and logic. Yes, there are huge uncertainties, but just like the horse was put out to pasture a century ago, it's very hard to imagine the internal combustion engine won't be sidelined in the coming years, albeit many decades. Next, let's step inside to the working environment. Remember the people that we're interfacing with. Looking at historical vehicle mileage versus how wealthy people are, my team sees some strong trends. Basically, once you reach a certain level of wealth, you buy a car. Then as you get richer, you drive that car further, and then at a certain point, you reach saturation. There's only so many kilometers you want to drive, 10, 15,000 kilometers per year per vehicle, depending on where you live. Now, a bit of modeling leads us to gross that up to the global level to think that the vehicle kilometers driven will roughly double by mid-century. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen here in Poland. It's probably going to be driven much more by what happens in Southeast Asia in the next decade and the decade after, and Africa in the decades after that. So is this a forecast? Not really. Remember what George Box said about models. All models are wrong, but some are useful. We put a range of uncertainty around our projections, as the amount of growth depends on a lot of variables. However, the urge to travel has been with us since at least Roman times, so it's a trend with a lot of history behind it. So where are all the vehicles going to come from? Well, electric vehicle manufacturing is basically a 3-horse race. You have Chinese manufacturers, you have Tesla in the United States, and then you have the legacy Western automakers. Each company has its own strategy, technology preferences, and it's influenced by the regulatory environment in their home market. Again, lots of uncertainties. But if you watch closely how these companies are planning, you can see some forward-looking indicators. Before a company can build an electric car, it's got to build a factory to produce the batteries, or it's got to reconfigure a factory to be able to assemble. We look at trends like that. Then you have to consider the regulator. Countries have introduced internal combustion engine bans. Some countries you won't be able to buy internal combustion engine vehicles beyond 2035. And then finally, it's important to keep an eye on social dynamics. Young people are typically more climate aware than their parents, but they also still like mobility. So are they going to avoid the car and use the train instead? Or perhaps their world will be more online, and they will work and play more from home, and they won't travel as much. We don't know the answers to all these questions, but we'll use them as ingredients in building our scenarios and guiding our modeling exercises. Now, finally, we come to the core question. So here, for Shell, it's how will energy demand in light-duty road transport, cars, evolve over the next few decades? Shell has 45,000 tank stations around the world, which I hope some of you visit. We fuel 30 million people every day. How is that network going to change? Where are people going to charge? How long will it take? Etc. Given all these uncertainties, we've developed 2 scenarios to examine this problem and other problems: Sky 2050 and Archipelagos. Each scenario comprises of a narrative and an accompanying quantification. Now, Sky is a normative scenario that focuses on reaching net zero in 2050 in what is effectively a sophisticated goal-seek exercise, similar to what other institutions have undertaken. We take various uncertainties mentioned previously and we fashion them into a narrative that sees a competitive dynamic driving down the cost of electric vehicles, which are eagerly bought by consumers who appreciate their improved efficiency and ultimately their lower carbon footprint, providing you charge them with low carbon power. The narrative conveys the key assumptions, how they fit together. For example, EV technology continues to deliver. There are no holdups in the supply chain. Customers value low emissions. They'll actually pay for it. Policy support is rapid and continuous. Our second scenario is a bit different. It's called archipelagos. It's a more exploratory world. That's to say, we look at the trends we see today, which perhaps aren't quite as aggressive as what you see in Sky, and it plays them out. The narrative is that of a more fragmented world, with regional rivalries, and the competition is the kind that slows things down by, for example, tariffs, reducing the flow of electric vehicles between different markets. In both scenarios, the underlying modeling deficient quantification and uncertainties of both the narrative and the quantification truly convey the uncertainties. So what's next on our horizon? Well, like many of you, we're taking a look at artificial intelligence. Self-driving cars are an interesting concept for a scenario professional. They combine technological change with something that can potentially be very impactful. Let's think for a moment, on the one hand, how shared electric vehicles in cities could replace internal combustion engine vehicles at a rate of 10 to 1. All of a sudden, you'd have far less congestion. You'd need far less car parking. But you'd probably have far fewer people traveling on public transport. Good things, maybe not good things. On the other hand, you're probably going to get a rebound effect. How many of you would jump in a self-driving car and be driven somewhere overnight on Friday night so you could go on holiday on Saturday and Sunday in a faraway place in the country? People would probably do that. When you give them a new opportunity, they generally harness it. So I don't know what the answers to these things are, but that's for my team to think about in the coming year. Hopefully this has been an illustrative example of how we use scenarios. I've got to advertise. If you go to shell.com/scenarios, you can get more details. But I'd really like to close by re-emphasizing that scenarios are not predictions or forecasts. They're a tool to convey uncertainty by presenting plausible alternative futures based on a systematic analysis of the business environment. So as leaders, I encourage you to embrace these possible futures and reflect on how you can position your organizations for success. Thank you.